This week, I talk with Tessa Hulls, author of the graphic memoir Feeding Ghosts, a book about Chinese history, trauma, psychology, family relationships, and more. I interview Tessa about the book and how she learned to make comics, and then Emmet joins me to review the book. As always, a reminder that you can support the podcast by pledging a few bucks a month at patreon.com/deconcomics. Or if you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. This is Tim.
This is Emmet.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Emmet in Country Victoria, Australia. How are you?
I'm very well, Tim. Thank you. I'm good.
So this time we're going to be talking about a book called Feeding Ghosts by Tessa Hulls. And this is a book about her kind of family history and Chinese history. Her background is Chinese. Her mom and her grandmother escaped from China under Mao. And you'll hear a lot more explanation here in a second. I'm going to start out with an interview that I did with Tessa a while back, and then Emmet and I will come back and talk about the book. Hey, now I'm talking with Tessa Hulls, who happens to be in Montana. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
I guess you've been doing a lot of media and appearances and stuff for your book, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm mostly just using book tour as an excuse to visit all of my friends, regardless of where they live.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I'm having a blast.
Right. So you've done a book called Feeding Ghosts. And to start, I wanted to try to summarize this book, but it's not easy. But basically, it's a story from your own family of how trauma in one generation of a family is felt by subsequent generations. So I'd like you to tell us a bit about each of the three generations of women in your book. So tell us first about your grandmother.
Yeah, the story begins with my grandmother, Sun Yi. I grew up with her living in my nuclear family, but really didn't know very much about her past other than that she had been a journalist in Shanghai during the communist takeover, and what happened to her in the political aftermath of that when she was labeled a political dissident had caused her to lose her mind. And so basically by the time I was born, she had been living within her own madness for decades. And she and my mom had to flee China to Hong Kong. And my mother essentially grew up raised as a charity case by a colonial boarding school while my grandmother was in a mental institution. So there's a lot of weight to the story. And I didn't begin the book until I was in my 30s and felt equipped to enter the story and sort of survive the telling of it. So even though I can't change the fact that it's a very heavy topic, I tried to also make it funny wherever I could.
Yeah. Yeah, it was funny in places. Yeah, I don't know if necessarily funny, but I liked how your dinosaur-shaped pencil holders kept showing up. I guess are those real? Those are on your desk somewhere?
Oh, yeah, those are corporeal objects. The Brontosaurus is Norbert and the Triceratops is Winnie. And, I didn't really necessarily begin at the outset thinking that they were going to be like guardians or talismans. It was just the way I was showing the reader, like, hey, we're in my studio now and I'm narrating from the present. But, I think the fact that these absurd dinosaurs show up when I'm talking about like mass beheadings and famines killing tens of millions of people, they did become necessary points of levity.
Yeah, well, the word stegosaurus is not one you would expect to hear in this conversation, but...
Well, I always try and sneak dinosaurs in where I can.
Okay, so yeah, that's basically what the book's about, and we'll come back to it. But I wanted to ask you, so I listened to part of another interview with you. They're all over the internet, many interviews with you I found. And you said you chose to use comics to tell the story because the visual aspect was necessary. You had several different timelines going, and it was going to be too confusing just as prose. And I'll come back to the timelines. But in the book, we see in 2018, you've come back from visiting the part of your family that lives in China, and you've decided to start making this book, and we see your to-do list from that time. And two of the items are learn to draw comics and learn to write a book. Those sound like pretty big tasks. I'm wondering how you approached those.
I've always been a very experiential learner, and I do best when I cannonball into the deep end. So I think over the years, as someone who's been a multidisciplinary artist and has kind of always allowed the story to dictate the form it wants to take, I had a lot of faith in my ability to learn. And so I didn't grow up reading comics outside of Calvin and Hobbes and Tintin, which obviously were deep and seminal influences. It's funny going back and looking at my childhood sketchbooks, you can really see how much Bill Watterson just sunk in on every level of my subconscious. But I was a painter and an essayist. And so I didn't know how to draw comics or write a book, but I did understand fluency in one visual language. And I did, from an entire childhood of reading as a place of sanctuary. You know, I think the tens of thousands of books that I'd read had just osmotically seeped in. So once I really started tackling this book after I turned 30, I just devoured graphic novels for the first time and took advantage of the public library in Seattle. And I would just go pick them up like a linear foot at a time, totally at random, just because I wanted to take in as much as I could broadly and study them.
So what did you read?
Oh, absolutely everything. Because I think specifically I wasn't looking for just, you know, the graphic novel highest levels of the canon, because I think often you learn the most from failed experiments. And so I was reading with a critical eye, wanting to maybe see makers who had made things that weren't entirely successful, to kind of learn what the pitfalls were. And I think that's part of why by the time I actually really started drawing and writing in earnest, I had a really clear idea of which aspects of which graphic novels I was really aiming for. So I read everything, but by the end, I knew that I was wanting to take the intellectual and literary rigor of Fun Home and combine it with the blending of the historical and familial narrative of Persepolis, and then the precision of Black Hole and the fluidity of This One Summer, and then sort of a lot of sprinklings from Epileptic, The Best We Could Do, and Mouse. So I feel like by the end of it, you know, yes, those are incredibly ambitious touchstones. But I think I spent the first 4 years of this book just learning and studying before I began to draw, just to kind of learn the skills I needed to pull it off.
So I thought you were good at coming up with ways to represent things symbolically. The fight between the Chinese nationalists and the communists is represented by the toy Rock'em Sock'em robots. Do you have any particular favorites in terms of how you graphically represented things?
Well, I think that's why I chose this medium for this book, is there are panels that can essentially do the work of what might take 2,000 written words. And so there's one scene where I draw a series of Russian nesting dolls, and my grandma is one of the smaller ones, encased within this larger layer of a wooden Mao. And that was my way of showing the reader that my grandmother's mental collapse was tied to what was happening in mainland China. So like that's a visual device where essentially I'm always looking for these openings of where can I do something that in the space of, you know, an index card, I can buy myself like 4 pages of emotional exposition and metaphor.
So I noticed on like some of the pages, like between chapters and elsewhere, there's this kind of texture that we see a lot. It kind of looks like water or plants. And later I started thinking, oh, the ghosts that appear in the book have that texture too. So is that texture meant to symbolize the ghosts, or what was the meaning behind that?
Yeah. I think those patterns are just, you know, swarms of ghosts. And I think for me, I write in the book about how I was always a really sensitive child. And I think in general, artists are just people who are not particularly good at shutting out the world. And so this family trauma that I grew up with in my home, I think for my mom and my grandma, it had been normalized for so long that they really didn't see it. But for me, it really was like every surface of my house was just covered in these unresolved, unexamined ghosts.
So these are ghosts of like issues and events, right? More than of individual people.
Yeah. I think it's just the way in which my mom and grandma managed to flee China and make it to the US eventually, but they never really got to a point of peace with what had happened to them preceding that. And I think that just kind of calcified in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, maybe talk more about how it affected you, the situation between your grandma and your mom, and how did that affect you?
Well, I think it turned me into a cowboy, by which I mean I really leaned into hyper independence, and a lot of that was seeing this codependent relationship between my mom and my grandma, where my mom basically spent her entire life taking care of her mother at the cost of her ability to really live for herself. And from my mom's Chinese viewpoint, that was an act of love and duty. And from the American context in which I was raised, yes, there was something very admirable to that, but it was also a really profound tragedy. And so when I was younger, I basically leaned into the idea of getting as far away as possible, very literally. And I was fascinated by pursuing extremes and frontiers, mostly beginning with biking alone across the country. I went on a 5,000-mile solo bike ride from Southern California to Maine, and then got a job as a chef in Antarctica, and then started taking remote seasonal contracts in Alaska. And always felt like maybe at some point I would find the far edge of that thirst for the frontier, and I never did. And really, this book was my way of answering, not so much a question, but responding to the heartbreaking epiphany that there was nowhere far enough away that would ever make me free of these ghosts until I turned and faced them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Antarctica is another word I didn't expect in this conversation. You were a DJ on a radio station there?
Yeah, ICE 104.5. It was fantastic. And actually, that's kind of what brought me to embracing this metaphor of the cowboy, because there is a room full of vinyl records down there, which is specifically pressed just for play on a military basis. And so they don't have any of the album art. And there's an old school analog card catalog for finding things down there. And by being a DJ, I had access to that room. And that's where I fell in love with 1940s high lonesome cowboy ballads, because they're so beautiful, and they're so simple, and they're so fake, because human beings are social creatures. And as much as we might tell ourselves that all we need is to hop on our horse and ride off into the sunset, solitude will eventually break a person. And I really, I just loved that metaphor in addition to the actual music.
So I'm a little confused about this. That you said there's no cover art on these albums. Was there like a label, like so you'd know which record it was, like just a title and artist?
So they were all in manila sleeves, and they had cutouts in the middle, and so they were just serial numbers on the outside. So you would look at the serial numbers in the card catalog, but then the center disc on the record, they're just black and white. They have the logo for the Armed Forces Radio and Television Service, and that's it. It's pretty sparse.
Okay, so you could like see the label on the record through like a window in the sleeve.
Yeah, it was just a blank cutout, and there's even one shelf of just Foley sound effects. So there was everything down there.
Yeah, I used to work on a military base, and I would hear them, the commercials they made locally, and I'm sure that's what they were using sound effects for.
Oh, that's awesome.
So what was the hardest thing for you about learning to make comics?
I think unlearning how to be a painter, because I had a lot of, I'm not going to say bad habits, but really different habits. And I tend to be incredibly detailed as a painter. And also, I usually work in a really, really bright, varied color palette. And so doing this book in black and white, the whole thing is drawn in Japanese brush pen. And it took me a while to really understand how to convey environments and contrast without having access to color or shading. So just from a technical standpoint, I think that took me a long time to learn. And then the concision of comics, I think it's one thing to go into an awareness of how few words you can put on a page. And then it's another thing entirely to then be faced with the challenge of explaining the Cultural Revolution in 3 pages. And Feeding Ghosts did end up clocking in at about 60,000 words, which is definitely more than the typical graphic novel, but significantly less than a written book of that length.
Yeah, well, and if the art gets too detailed in the comic, it can start to make it feel kind of stiff and not, there's no energy to it. So, but I think you did fine on that. It didn't get too detailed, but it's cartoony enough to kind of flow.
Yeah, and I think that's something I had to learn along the way, because I think what happens when you're rendering too much is you lose the ability to guide the viewer on a through line, because everything sort of becomes given equal visual value. And there's a necessary simplicity to comics that I think is, if you're doing it right, nobody sees it. But if you're doing it wrong, it's immediately clear.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So how long did this project take from when you decided to do it to when the book came out?
9 years.
9 years.
So
Wow.
it's the entirety of my 30s.
Okay. And talk about the research that was required. I mean, you had to research both your family and Chinese history.
Yeah, because they were really one and the same. So after my mom and grandma fled China, my grandmother ended up writing a memoir called 8 Years in Red Shanghai: Love, Starvation, Persecution. And it was about her years of being a single mother while being persecuted by the communist government. And I vaguely knew that my grandmother had written this book and that she had been critical of the Communist Party, but I really didn't have the necessary political and historical context to really understand what that meant. And so as I began researching Chinese history, basically trying to learn about what was happening during the years my grandmother was born into, it really made me aware of sort of the full measure of my own ignorance. And so I just read voraciously, really anything I could get my hands on to learn the bones of the history. And then once I had that translation of my grandmother's memoir in hand, I built out a spreadsheet of basically anything in it that I could fact check. And there's a panel in the book where it shows that spreadsheet, or at least a snip out from it. And then I went to Shanghai and started just tracking things down. So the research was kind of threefold. First was reading, then was 2 months in Hong Kong, because there I knew that a lot of the material that I would be looking for would be in English because of the colonial government. And then the bulk of my time in China came in the second research trip, where I spent 2 months there basically ground truthing and following up anything that I had flagged from my grandma's memoir. Mm-hmm. And that was the easy part, because none of that part really had to be like talking about feelings or pain.
Right. So I mentioned the timelines before. So explain what these timelines were that you were kind of interweaving here.
Well, I knew that I was throwing my reader into the middle of something profoundly complicated, where there were essentially 6 different timelines that I was following: China's past, China's present, Hong Kong's past, Hong Kong's present, my family's past, my family's present. And throughout the 11 sections of the book, I am dancing between all 6 timelines in pretty much every section. So I open the book with a timeline giving about 100 years of Chinese history and showing that as a bar graph with China, Hong Kong, my mother, my grandmother, and myself all on one page, so that you can really see how all of these things are actually inseparable. And yeah, that was the dance of the book, is making sure I was telling all of those different threads of history, both personal and political, in a way that was still navigable.
Mm-hmm. And the approach you took, it's kind of in sequence, but it's kind of not. You could kind of jump around in each chapter. I think it works, though, but I'm wondering how you arrived at that style rather than, you could have done it just strictly chronologically and start here and then this, but
initially I did try to do that, and quickly realized that it meant the book would be really unbalanced, because the heaviest history sections would dominate it, and you wouldn't really get the context of my childhood until 2/3 to 3/4 of the way into the book. And
yeah, you'd be kind of wondering, why is she writing about this?
yeah. And I think because in so many ways, the book is about what happens when trauma breaks a mother in such a way that she is unable to be a mother. And what does that child in turn become? And so the way in which our childhoods are shaped by the damage of our mothers is such a crucial part of how I'm talking about this history that I kind of needed the reader to understand a little bit more about the home that I had grown up in before I started explaining the history.
Now, of course, as you said, part of it is Chinese history in the book, and then how it affected your family. And these were events that affected large parts of the population of China, like the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. And some of these were really terrible things. A lot of them were really terrible things. And so I'd studied some Chinese history in college, but I still learned quite a bit of like detail from this book that I didn't know before. I hadn't been aware that Mao started the Cultural Revolution to save his own reputation. Like, thinking, what a guy. He gets the country to tear itself apart so that he wouldn't look bad after all the deaths that he was blamed for in the Great Leap Forward. So, yeah, what'd you think of Mao in researching this?
I mean, honestly, it makes me wince at my past self who, grew up on the West Coast and went to a smaller liberal arts college where people wore Mao caps and talked about communism. And yeah, I mean, I was incredibly ignorant to really the sheer extent of the atrocities that his regime caused. And I think to some extent, I can see where I should hold some grace for my ignorance on that, because the fact that so much of this is not more broadly known is not coincidence or accident. It's China rigidly controls the narrative of both its present and its past. And there has been, a deliberate attempt across generations to erase the fact that any of this happened. And within mainland China, it's impressive and horrifying how much a revisionist history has already been imposed on the things that I talk about in my book.
I got the impression that gaslighting citizens and treating them horribly was kind of a pattern of Chinese government even before the communists came to power. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that.
And I felt like Mao was kind of flying by the seat of his pants, like promoting things that seemed like good ideas but weren't, like killing all the sparrows.
Yeah, I mean, it was very much ideology over reality. And in that case, the campaign to eliminate four pests, it was a lot of well-intentioned science denial that really catalyzed, I believe, the worst famine in human history.
Wow. So I know you mainly did this book to try to, you said in the book, to try to mend your relationship with your mom, but it seems to have been a form of therapy for you personally, to the point where I'm not sure why you were comfortable sharing it with the world.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think I had to do this. My family ghost literally told me I had to. And as illustrated by the fact that I went to Antarctica, I put in a really good faith effort to run from this. But at the end of the day, yeah, I do think I felt a sense of duty to this unresolved story within my family, and knew that only by telling this would I be able to kind of escape this generational pattern of the women in my family becoming too closed off from the world to be able to have close human ties. And I talk in the book about how my mother had this crippling fear of mental illness because of what she saw happen to her own mother. And so she projected that onto me from a very, very young age. And I kind of joke in the book that because of some of the things that led to, therapy is not really a field that has ever felt like a viable healing option for me. And so this book was maybe the only way I knew how to touch on some of these things, because some other paths just didn't feel available.
Do you have any plans to make any more books or comics?
Books, no. Comics, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I've learned that I'm a creature that does better with smaller projects. I really struggled with how much making this book took me out of engaging with the world.
Mm.
And I know some people just want to stay in a room and draw and live inside their own stories, but for me, that was pretty unbearable. And so what I'm interested in doing is because I do have this background as somebody with a lot of remote backcountry experience in environments in the Arctic and Antarctic. I'm really interested in becoming an embedded comics journalist, working with science teams that are going out in the field and basically becoming their communications arm. So that is what I'm going to try and pivot what I'm doing towards.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for your time today. It was good information. And yeah, I would recommend the book to listeners. So anyway, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks again for the invite. Nice chatting.
Coming up, Emmet and I review Feeding Ghosts. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. Deconstructing Comics earns a bit of money from your purchase that helps us keep the show going. We really appreciate your support. When you watched Batman as a kid, you enjoyed the colorful heroes and villains, the text sound effects on the screen, the thrill of watching a heroic crime fighter escaping from death traps and taking down bad guys. But the show was devised to interest adults too. What did you miss as a kid? Sexual innuendo.
The penguin's too small for me.
Closeted gay characters.
I like that cape, Batman.
Freudian death traps.
Has the giant clam really swallowed Robin?
Police incompetence.
Bruce Wayne is a millionaire playboy. Hardly a secret identity for Batman.
Whether you're a kid or an adult, there's something to like about our favorite Caped Crusader. Tim and Paul dig for the deeper meanings under the Batmania every month. What's the podcast's name?
To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles.
Okay, so we're back. I'm back with Emmet here. And so what's your impression of this book? What's the first thing your first impression of it when you started reading it?
Well, my first impression of this book was that, my goodness, this is a very large book.
Yes.
That's the first impression. But there is much to observe here and dig into. And the listeners will have heard your interview with Tessa Hulls, and I heard an earlier version of that interview, and I did enjoy your interview technique where you sort of just lobbed the question at her. So what's this? In particular, I loved your question. This seems like a form of therapy. You know, it's a very therapeutic experience. You've put all this information. Why would you share this with the world? Which, again, very right between the eyes, Tim. And that's it. That is what this is. It's a, as you talked about in your introduction, it's a family history that's wrapped up in a nation's history. In this case, it's the history of China during various colonial occupations and the rise of the communist regime and the experience of that schism with Taiwan and Hong Kong as well, mainly Hong Kong. And all the different forces that come to play on a person having to negotiate those lines, never mind transplanting to America, which is another. She does talk about that layering effect that you sometimes have with the immigrant experience. You're trying to negotiate all these different code signals.
Right. And her mom is really thinking in a Chinese way and having kind of Chinese expectations of her daughter, and her daughter doesn't really know how to meet those.
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at there, because those are the presentations. That isn't necessarily so. When we say her mother is thinking in a Chinese way, her mother is saying that she's thinking in a Chinese way, which is the idea of the dutiful daughter and the dutiful the mother-daughter relationship and associating maternalness with China in contrast to America. And then the daughter, in this case Tessa Hulls, personifies herself as the cowboy archetype. Mm-hmm. And both of these versioning performances are complicated because the more we learn about the mother, the more we discover actually her upbringing was largely facilitated by her access to Britishness. That was her Eurasian nature, the fact that she is the daughter of a foreign diplomat, and her mother's celebrity for denouncing the communist regime, makes her, in effect, un-Chinese, as far as the CCP would be concerned. And ostracized and surveilled and targeted. And the daughters, Tessa, the author in this case, and as you say, this is all just being presented to us. The archetype of the cowboy is equally complex, I find, because maybe this is not a textual reading, but the cowboy is presented as a figure of whiteness, particularly white Americanness. But the cowboy is not white. I mean, the cowboy as an actual historical, the cowboy as in a historical event were typically black or people of color.
Well, that's true too. Yeah,
you know. So the claiming of the whiteness of the cowboy that American culture does is itself another layering effect that can be challenged. So this book, in a way, is sort of presenting all these different versions of stories that we tell about ourselves and then collapsing them. And with a particular focus on the family's memory of their experience of communist China. But equally, I mean, you and I, we're both immigrants, in other countries.
Certainly expats, yeah.
And we present versions of ourselves to negotiate these places we're in that rely on a shared understanding of what Americanness and what Irishness is, right? So I would say that we too are fronting a lot of the time. Like we present ourselves in a way that maybe it gains us access to these foreign cultures through being a version of those country types. But that's not necessarily who we actually are. That I sort of was conscious while reading this book that I would be talking to you, and I was particularly conscious of whether you were picking up on the immigrant narrative as a way of telling stories. And when we talk about the grandmother Sun Yi's mental collapse, I mean, there is something about that. When you have told so many stories about yourself, when do you lose the thread of yourself? And there's an Australian writer called Bob Ellis, and he once advanced the theory, which really disturbed me, which was the immigrant experience is essentially a schizophrenic one. Because you are trapped between.
Well, yeah, you're always away from home, for one thing.
You're never home. Yeah, you're always unhomed in a weird way. Even though you may be in a place you've settled, you have friends, you have family, you have relationships, and so on, but you'll always be other than that on some level. So I think that was a sort of the thread of this that I grabbed onto was how we have that idea of layering stories and narratives and the threat that they may collapse beneath us and what that might entail. There's this visual metaphor throughout the book of this vast, grasping void of shapeless mouths and claws and talons, and that's the sort of the fear she has of her own mental instability, this idea of inherited mental instability that might be in the offing. And I mean, that's also the immigrant experience in a way, in that, you are without the net of home and nation and people. You are trying to reinvent yourself, and sometimes we fall.
Well, and I was kind of identifying with her mom in a way because, my kids were born and grew up here in Japan. And, culturally, they're about 90% Japanese. They have a little bit of America kind of sprinkled in from me, but, they know Dr. Seuss better than Japanese kids do. But for the most part, they're Japanese in a lot of ways that I am not always completely in touch with. I'm like, oh yeah, her thinking is that way because she grew up here. So yeah, I mean, of course I don't have the past of a mentally unstable mother. That part of her mother's story I can't identify with, but the part of like dealing with a daughter who grew up in the country that you're now living in rather than what you grew up with, it's certainly part of my life too. As I mentioned in the interview, I have some history of studying about China and a little bit of the language, but there were a lot of details that I had never picked up before. And it struck me just how hard it's been to live in China over the decades. World War II and, cheesy governments who are terrible to the people, and all kinds of mass suicides and mass murdering, people murdering other people because of some political ideology that's been forced on them. And yeah, it's just crazy. And that Sun Yi, the grandmother, had published a book, and the family was afraid to even own a copy of it because they could get in trouble. And she had to avoid any contact with them when she and her daughter really could have used the help.
Yeah, the book's title is, I believe, 8 Years in Red Shanghai, Love, Starvation, Persecution. And
the book her grandmother wrote, yeah.
I did look for Sun Yi's book. I actually tried to see if I could find it. And the only trace of it that I could find, and again, that's all what this conversation around this book is about traces and lingering memories and all the ghosts. But the only trace of it I could find was Tessa's own efforts to research the book. Like she's posting on forums asking for assistance in tracking down some of the locations that she's heard about through the family storytelling. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was interesting. But in the graphic novel, we're shown that the book is a physical object. It exists, and it's something that they hand around. And when we engage with the book, Hulls used the technique of having a font, a particular kind of font, to represent the narration from the book. So distinguished from, I'm not telling this story now, this is Sun Yi's version of events, and then Tessa Hulls keeps interrogating that version of events. You can't bullshit a bullshitter, she says at one point. Like, this is, again, a version of history that is being told by a person who is trying to escape that history. So there is an interesting self-interrogation, not just of the author, but of their family, and then of the history of the place she's from, because a lot of the history of that place has been censored or rewritten, and that's really fascinating. That I just wanted to read the book myself, or see if I could find a copy of the book, a translation of the book, or even a writing about the book, so that I can maybe assess a secondary reader's version of it. Because this is the author interrogating her emotional response to, my grandmother was sleeping with men to escape her circumstances. Oh my God, I can't believe she did that. And I'm wondering if, were I to read it, would I take away something else from it? Would I have taken away, this is somebody desperately trying to survive? And I don't know. I don't want to imply any judgment, but I just sort of, I would be curious to read those words in their original context, despite the fact that I cannot speak Shanghaise or Mandarin or Cantonese or anything. I can't read characters. It would have to be a translation, and then I'm relying on the translator to have understood what has been said and not have an agenda. Oh, it's a complicated web we weave here, Tim.
Well, I'm not sure that there is a translation other than the one that Tessa herself commissioned, and I don't think it was ever published in English. So I would have to ask Tessa for her copy, maybe. Which
is fascinating, because you think the the British Hong Kong sort of enclave would be interested in disseminating this as a counter narrative. Because there was a lot of propaganda. This is something my mother told me. Back in the 60s, there was lots of talk of, like the Beatles lyric, back in the USSR, you don't know how lucky you are. There was this sense of, just behind the Iron Curtain, everything's sweet. Things are great. And then people who would have left or escaped or defected or whatever you want to say, would come with different stories and say, no, it's awful. It's really bad. Like there's all these. We don't have bread sometimes. We don't have food. We these mile-long queues to get access to services. All these things. So you'd have these competing narratives, and like so much about the Cold War, the impression I get is that nobody really knew who to believe, and you basically picked your side, and that became your truth, and that's a very unsteady position to be in. Which is why I love the metaphor of the sort of lapping waves of their boat to Hong Kong. They're escaping is it Hong Kong or Shanghai? I apologize.
Hong Kong.
It is Hong Kong. The waves introduce that sense of instability, and she talks about her mother constantly remembering that moment, the moment of the waves, and it feels like that is how we exist within history at times. We are being buffeted about by all these different versions of events, and we have at certain points in our lives learned that you can't always trust the historian. They may have an agenda.
Yeah, well, she seems to be really good at these visual metaphors. Another one is she talks about how you can't get a complete picture of her grandmother's story, so you have to take the element of her being a journalist amidst all the changes in China, and then also her mental decline that she wasn't aware she was kind of writing about as it was happening. And so she visualizes that as a viewmaster, like I used when I was a kid to look at, Batman or something. And you have two lenses that you're looking at the pictures through that combined kind of tell the whole story, or an actual viewmaster makes it 3D, but yeah. So I thought that was interesting.
It's also a work of memoir, and as such, she does that thing that a lot of people who write memoirs, and these are usually prose memoirs, they cite other writers. And they invoke these other writers to sort of give you a point of entry and a sense of the time. And so I thought some interesting examples of people cited. So Edward Abbey, so he wrote lots of westerns, including some that were filmed. But he's also an environmental activist and an anarchist, and he's a really interesting character, Edward Abbey. Kat Chow's Seeing Ghosts is quoted from. That seems like a deliberate allusion in the title of Feeding Ghosts. So, and again, it's a sort of Asian American experience memoir. But the other person that I was interested in was, I believe it's Adrienne Rich, and her poem Diving into the Wreck. And it sort of interrogates the poet's own femininity and the sort of telling of stories, the telling of history, and whether that is itself a gendered act. And whose story gets shared through history, whose story gets told through myth. And there's a little piece here that is not quoted in the graphic novel. Hulls focuses on the idea of the poem's title is Diving to the Wreck, so she focuses on the idea of the wrecked vessel that's been sunk, in contrast to her family history, this idea of trauma burying their sense of history. But there's this bit at the end that I thought was quite powerful. We are, I am, you are, by cowardice or courage, the one who find our way back to this scene, carrying a knife, a camera, a book of myths in which our names do not appear. So there's an idea of you descend and then you reemerge, but who gets to descend? And the woman poet is sort of not just braving this descent herself; she's actually collapsing herself into a sort of collective I, like we are, I am, you are, and then the grammar again gets a little confusing. By cowardice or courage, the one who find our way. There's a sort of singularity of experience from this diver that includes multiple points of view, not just the male point of view, and the history telling of men. So I find that really interesting that this is a book about women, a family of women, a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, trying to tell their story when so much of similar stories of women has been erased or buried or lost. And that's sort of another thread that, I thought was a rewarding way to follow her musings into this memoir.
So what did you think of this as a first published comics work? She had to learn to make comics, as she admits in the book itself, and so this was really her first try at it, and it's such a big project too.
Yes, and she took 9 years, she said, to actually produce this. Yeah, I think you can actually see her engage more and more with the comic frame, the comic as a medium, as the book progresses, because at the beginning, look, I'll be honest, if I was to pick this off the shelf straight away without any context and somebody handed me this, I read the first few pages, I probably would have bounced off it. Okay, and one of the reasons for that is that I think comics are all about balance. You talked to her about this in your interview as well, but there's this balance of image and text, and you can unbalance it deliberately for effect, and sometimes that really works. And there is again a trend in what I would call prestige graphic novel memoir, which we probably would assign a start date of Spiegelman's Mouse going forward, where that imbalancing effect can be very dramatic and actually is a good way to lead the reader into some essential information, usually through shock or juxtaposition. But I felt that at the beginning, there was all this information being shoved to the foreground.
Yeah, she kind of summarizes the whole thing at the beginning. Yeah.
Which I immediately was thinking, this should be a book. This should be prose. This should be a memoir. And my sort of unkind reflection was, has somebody had a word to say, do you know what? You're better off making this a graphic novel because you'll have less competition. Because the sort of Chinese-American experience has been mined by other writers, including some writers who are actually cited in this. And maybe you're better off making a comic book because then at least you have a sort of lower barrier to entry to a critical reception. But as the book progresses, I felt it became more and more poetic, both in its use of language and its use of imagery, and more confident. And the framing device of the void wasn't simply a chapter break. It became a sort of moment of trauma that we, along with her, keep re-experiencing. We have this moment of, oh God, the blackness is back. Oh no, the blackness of history, which we're all yearning to escape. So yes, overall, I thought it was very worthy as an opening effort. It's a work of graphic memoir. I think there are other examples of this that I feel maintain that balance really well. So I would mention Safdar Ahmed's Still Alive, Notes from Australia's Immigration Detention System, which is a work of graphic journalism. Very powerful piece of writing, very powerful use of imagery, spare use of text, until it is used to actually really hammer home some ideas that needed to be sort of said, if you like, and then the sort of comic text almost speaks. So that is a question of balance. But the fact that this is sort of coming into view as an overall comic work seems a parallel to her own, confronting the family's truth and her own thoughts on that over time, sort of coming to a new conclusion, which I think you were sort of drawing out of her in that interview. That's where you both were sort of circling this idea of, well, how do you talk about this in a way that's not like self-wounding almost?
The thing that stuck out to me a little bit that if I were her editor, I probably would have pointed out some things. Reading order was not always clear. Sometimes like, am I supposed to go across or down here? And yeah, I had a number of pages, like page 222. I think there are a couple of columns of text, and then there's also a set of word balloons that are bending from, down and to the right, and they're sort of above those other boxes. And I just couldn't figure out what order she wanted me to read that in.
Yeah. The moment where the book sort of came into focus for me as being sort of emotionally powerful was when there's a sort of fractured memory of Tessa, a younger Tessa, at home with her grandmother, waiting for her mother, whose English name is Rose. That's the name she was assigned in boarding school, is Rose. So Sun Yi's waiting for Rose to come home, and as the hour gets closer to when she'll be home, Sun Yi just becomes more and more anxious and more frantic, to the point where when she finally comes in the door, Sun Yi like pounces on her, and in this sort of desperate way. And I thought that was extremely moving. And it sort of, then I started becoming more charitable towards the work, and it really made me pause and go, okay, this is actually something that's being very sincere, and I appreciate that. I appreciate somebody just going, here's my stuff, here's what I got.
Yeah. The only other little complaint I had was that I thought it got a little long-winded in places. I didn't think it needed to be quite as long as it was. And there's a section where she's sort of repeating, it felt to me like repeating several times, like how her relationship with her mom was dysfunctioning. And I'm like, okay, that I understand that. Okay, you can stop talking about this. Move on to the next thing. So, yeah, it just felt, or other times I was kind of like, you really don't need to go into this part of it. It doesn't feel like it's that relevant, maybe. But yeah, if I were her editor, I might have gotten her to tighten it up a bit.
There's a bit where she talks about reading Sun Yi's book, and she says, I'm mining her book for clues to reverse engineer the thread of what broke. And that feels like a very interesting sort of like, I'm like truffle hunting for personal insights that will reveal something to me that I don't know. And then she's sort of broken away from. I mean, a lot of her opening discussion of her relationship with her mother is this idea of, well, I'm too white. I think she says, I'm not Chinese enough. So this is an American trying to engage with something very personal and very direct, which is her relationship to China. And yet all these signs in her life are saying, well, you're not Chinese. And when you have to do that, one of the issues, I think, is the sort of decolonialized, that's the word, perspective, is you sometimes have to come up with language. You actually have to come up with a way of speaking about this thing because nobody else is speaking about it for you.
Mm-hmm.
You have to invent the way of speaking about it. And that's maybe why you have all these references to other writers and other poets and other memoirists, because there's a sense of appealing to authority, saying, hey, I connect my experience to all these other people. Here's some traces for you to also follow. But maybe that's also why you have that repetition and that sort of overexposure of self and this family history, because it's like, well, nobody else is talking about this, so I need to.
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me of, there's another Australian comic creator, I think I've talked about him on here before, but Joshua Santos Spirito, who wrote a book called The Long Weekend in Alice Springs, which deals with a lot of Indigenous Australian experience and spirituality and sense of country and all these ideas. And it's a great graphic novel. No less a figure than Neil Gaiman proclaimed it a work of genius, and et cetera, et cetera. But Joshua has talked about how he met a man from this community, from the Indigenous Australian community, who basically said to him, go tell your own story. You know, he's not being rude to him, but he's saying, you know, you're speaking for us. Why don't you talk about yourself in that same way? And Santos Spirito went away and wrote Swallows, which is another immigrant experience graphic novel. It's about Italian Australians and how they came to Melbourne and their experience of being other and then becoming more and more Australian, and how they integrated into Australia, and the connection between Italy and Australia and Argentina. So you've got the city of the swallow. That's the metaphor of the book. This migration of the Italian immigrants. And that's similar to this in a way. It's a smaller book, but it's similar in that there were times where I felt Joshua was having to come up with a way of speaking about this for the first time, both visually and in his writing, in his text. He was having to actually construct a way of talking about this because nobody else is talking about this. And that's where maybe that lower point of entry that a graphic novel can provide is very useful to us, because the image and the text combined are very direct, and maybe you can get to the point, whereas the prose market is locked up. And there's less experimentation and there's less willingness to take a chance on somebody trying to tell an outsider perspective story that isn't so easily marketable. I will be interested to see what the reception of Feeding Ghosts is, because I did a little Google just looking for reviews and stuff, and like most reviews I saw were things where it was like, this is outstanding, this is really compelling, really amazing stuff, blah blah blah. But I couldn't see a lot of word of mouth reviews. You know what I mean? Like people just, oh, I'm reading this book right now, and here's what I think about it. There was less of that. It was more the sort of professional critic assessments that I was seeing. I'm interested because, like, that's the worry I have for the prestige graphic novels. Sometimes it's just like, it's a beautiful object, but do people actually engage with it? That's my worry.
Feeding Ghost is published by MCD Books. Thanks to our patrons for supporting Deconstructing Comics and our other podcasts. To join them, go to patreon.com/deconcomics. At deconstructingcomics.com, you can connect to us on X, Facebook, or YouTube, follow the link to shop at Amazon to support the show, and find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode on our site or drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. And now you can also send us a voicemail. Find the Leave a Voicemail link on the left sidebar of our site. Are you making a comic? Send it to us and we'll do a Critiquing Comics episode about it. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. Last week, Kumar and I left off at the climax of the long flashback sequence in Kentaro Miura's series Berserk. We couldn't wait to read on from there, so next week we're back with our discussion of volumes 13 and 14. We'll find out how the eclipse comes out, wrap up the flashback with the last few explanations that get us up to the status quo in the pre-flashback stories, and get started on a new post-Band of the Hawk story. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.